I'm Victoria Guida. I'm a trade reporter with Politico. Can you all hear me? Okay. Victoria Guida, I'm a trade reporter with Politico. Our first panel today is directed at drilling down a little bit more into the challenges at developing digital trade in developing countries, from physical infrastructure to complex policies by the government towards data and privacy. So here to talk about that first is Ralph Carter from FedEx.
Can we do it from here? Okay. I don't have any slides or anything. That's all right. Sounds like me in the morning. Good morning. Enough with the comedy routine. I'm Ralph Carter with FedEx. Pleased to be here this morning. Thanks to Dr. Aronson for inviting me. The conference is on digital trade, and digital issues are incredibly important to FedEx, of course, in terms of the ability of data to move across borders. As you know, the track and trace feature that you use every day when you track your package is a vital part of our service, and as we move packages around the world, the data packet that goes with that has got to be able to move around the world as well. And so those issues are incredibly important to us, and that's why we support a lot of the strong provisions that are in the TPP that protect those flows. But what I wanted to talk about this morning is the other side of the digital economy and the e-commerce society, and that's the physical movement of goods across borders. It's the Amazon that we do every day when we go online and buy things. And it's really a huge disruptor to the traditional models of trade. The 40-foot container with 100,000 items going from a large business to to another large business. Now we're seeing individual consumers using tool search engines to find individual items around the world and to buy them, oftentimes from a small retailer or merchant in a foreign country. And so this is having really an incredible impact in a number of ways. On the consumers, of course, they're able to access goods that they may not have access to in their own countries. And we're seeing this more and more. Consumers want what everybody else has. And so they're able now to see what's trending around the world, and they're able to buy those things. And what it also does is it exposes, I think, to them the costs of protectionist policies in their home countries. If they're able to see goods that they can't get at home, they wonder, why can't I get this here in my country? Or they might see that the price of that good is half the price or a third of the price that they have to pay in their own country. And so they start to question, why is this so expensive in my country? And I think that's a positive thing in terms of driving trade liberalization, opening their eyes to the fact that maybe there's some changes that can happen in their country to give them even better access to the global economy. So this is why e-commerce is now a $1 trillion business. It's projected to double and then probably triple in the next several years. If you look at examples like China, the Singles Day, that is their kind of online version of Valentine's Day for single folks, last November 11th, in 24 hours, the Chinese consumers purchased $14 billion worth of goods. And they purchased them from some, I think, 25 or 30 different countries around the world, so it wasn't all just domestic consumption. That figure is 60% more than they did the year before. And that's the trend that we're seeing in China. It's growing at close to 50% a year. The cross-border piece of China's e-commerce market is a $40 billion business. That's also growing very quickly. So on the consumer side, it's really transformational, but it's also transformational on the business side. Small businesses especially. I just returned from an APEC conference in Vietnam. And lots of great examples of small businesses, micro multinationals we call them now, using the internet to sell their goods around the world. One of the examples was an e-commerce platform in Mexico that was helping small companies get their goods online and get them exposed around the world. And there are lots of examples of small businesses doubling, tripling, quadrupling their sales as soon as they get online and find out how to do those search terms and all the things that merchants can do to maximize their exposure. It's the difference between being able to sell to the people that walk by your storefront to 1 billion people around the world. That's the scope of the transformation that we're seeing. And I think Brian Biron is going to be here later today. He's going to talk to you about all the great studies that eBay does. And, you know, the most amazing thing that they show, I think now, in terms of the impact on developing countries, is that an SME in a developing country who is using online platforms to sell their goods is just as likely to export, and export to the same extent as an SME in the United States. So technology, the fact that that SME has access to computer processing, to software, to all of the data that can get on the internet, and access to 1 billion consumers is the great equalizer. It really does put them on par with any other company in the world. And so this is the transformational impact that the digital economy is having, and it's a huge opportunity for developing countries. And I think a lot of developing countries are seeing that. It allows a small business to really kind of transcend the restrictions and limitations and small market of its home market and reach out and sell into the broader global market. So, you know, this is really one of the most exciting times we've seen in our industry in a long time. But the point is that the digital access, as important as it is, we've got to have physical access as well, physical connectivity. Because if you've got access to your customers through the internet, but if you can't get the goods to the customer in an efficient, cost-effective way, then it's not worth much. So what we talk about in our public policy dialogues is the importance of the customs and logistics piece of this, simplifying the movement of goods across borders. One of the things that we talk about and have been promoting for years as an industry is the World Customs Organization immediate release guidelines. You know, we don't need special tools to do this. We've got the tools and we've got the policy recommendations that are out there. And if we do this, along with implementing the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, which is pending out there, if we can simplify the movement of goods across borders, that's really one of the best things we can do to, again, unleash this power of e-commerce to a greater extent. One of the things that's included in this WCO recommendation is something called de minimis. It's the value below which goods are allowed into a country duty-free. And the United States just raised its duty de minimis from $200 to $800. And that's going to have a huge impact. And we want other countries to do the same thing and raise their de minimis, because there's no other measure we can take that will have a bigger impact on facilitating the movement of goods, and especially e-commerce, low-value shipments, individual shipments, than de minimis. Think about it this way. If you have an order of 100,000 sunglasses, it's coming in on a big container. You've got a stack of paperwork that you have to file to get that across the border. And big companies have the resources to do that. They have the people that can process all of that. They have a department that can do that. The small business, and certainly the consumer, doesn't have that capacity. But yet, the stack of papers required to get one set of sunglasses across the border is not that much smaller than the big stack. And so you've got a small business who looks at this and says, wow, that's really daunting for me to figure out how to do that. You've got a consumer, of course, who can't navigate that either. And so you get situations where maybe there's a delay in customs because one of the data pieces is not there, and you get a bad customer experience. And so what we're trying to do is rethink the way we look at this and have a paradigm shift in terms of we've got to find new ways to facilitate these B2C transactions, low-value shipments that are really driving trade these days. So And I know Uzman is here. He's going to talk about some of the other challenges to e-commerce, cross-border e-commerce. It's not just customs, it's payments, it's consumer protection, it's returns, and FedEx has now entered this space. We have a new service called FedEx Cross Border, and what it does is it gets in the middle and facilitates the transaction by giving the consumer all the information he needs or she needs to complete the transaction. It helps the retailer complete the transaction, a seamless web presence. And so this is where a lot of our resources and thought are going at FedEx, is to come up with solutions, again, to help drive the e-commerce businesses that we see around the world. And I'll give you two more examples. I was in Geneva 3 weeks ago, and I think there's a lot of enthusiasm and interest amongst trade negotiators in this question of how can the WTO or how can a group of countries do something to help this e-commerce opportunity and the small businesses? Could we come up with a set of rules that really does focus on small businesses and their access to the global economy and how they're using the internet, and how could we facilitate that? And we think that's an interesting idea, and perhaps maybe that's something that the WTO can start to look at. I'll leave you, one of the ambassadors that we talked to when we were there was from Pakistan, and he told us a story. He said his wife was looking for a certain kind of napkin with a certain kind of embroidery on it. And so she couldn't find it in Pakistan. But so she went on eBay, and she does a search, and she finds it. And the napkin is actually being shipped from a company in the UK. So she buys it, and she gets it, I don't know, a few days, a week later, and she opens it up. She's very happy with it. She looks at the napkin, and it was made in Pakistan. This is the power of the internet. She couldn't find it in her home country. She goes online, she finds it in the UK, brings it back home. Now, maybe next time she'll find it from the local supplier, but the fact that that transaction was facilitated by the internet, I think is pretty amazing and is a good example of the opportunity that's out there. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Sit down now or later?
I'll call you back up. Next, we have Sean Tan, who's with the World Bank.
And he wrote their report called Digital Dividends.
Okay, so thanks to the organizers for inviting me. As opposed to the other speaker, I have a lot of slides with tons of statistics, and anyway, so I'll start. So the digital technology accelerates growth through three channels: trade, productivity, and competition. Through trade, it can increase and enable firms to reach new markets, and for productivity, we see in our studies that for Vietnamese firms that are conducting e-commerce, they have higher productivity. And then for Mexican firms that are exposed to higher import competition from China, they use more e-commerce. So digital trade is a large part of this growth story. But I don't need to convince this audience about the benefits of digital trade. What I'm here to do is really to talk about the need for analog complements. So what is more important in this discussion is not really just simply adding internet to a country or introducing internet to a country to get firms to participate in e-commerce. There are actually barriers to e-commerce. And the four barriers that I wanted to focus on is digital access and the digital divide. The second one is logistics infrastructure. The third one is payment systems. And then the fourth is data and privacy issues. Okay, so there are all these slides with wonderful statistics and graphs. And okay, so for the first one, there's a significant digital divide that remains amongst between countries. So 6 billion people are without broadband internet, 4 billion people are without internet, and 2 billion people are without mobile phones. But the more important issue is really within countries as well. So we did a study of 10 African countries, and we found that it is the wealthy people, the men, the urban, and the young that have more access to internet in those countries. And this story plays out also amongst firms. It's really the larger firms that have that use more internet and the more productive firms that use internet. And one of the reasons is that digital products are still taxed as luxury goods in some countries, despite the efforts of the WTO and the ITA. There are still countries that are not part of the ITA, and then there are also countries that still impose import tariffs on computers, laptops, and mobile phones. So the second barrier that I wanted to talk about. Okay, that's fine. The second barrier I wanted to talk about is logistics infrastructure. So I have this graph plotting logistics performance index in 2007 to 2014. So you can see this sort of improvement of countries that have performed in the logistics performance index. You see a lot of countries have improved, but then you also see a lot of countries that have sort of stayed the same in these last 7 years. And interestingly, there's also a few countries that have deteriorated in terms of their logistics performance. And these are the issues that Ralph was talking about moving of goods across borders. But what is more important is also for the last mile, the delivery of goods. Yes. Okay. So this was the channels I was talking about: trade, productivity, and competition. Okay. So these are the countries with that still have import tariffs on these ICT products, computers, laptops, and mobile phones. And in some countries like Fiji, you have import tariffs of up to 30% on mobile phones. So this was the logistics performance index that I was talking about. So the line that you see is the 45-degree line. So basically, those countries that are on that line have similar scores in 2007 and 2014. You can see countries that have improved, like Rwanda, Serbia, Nepal, and Tanzania. But you also see countries that have deteriorated, so those countries below the line, like Somalia. But what was important is the last mile. This is the delivery of goods from the port to the homes. And there's still 36 countries with less than 50% of their population receiving mail delivery. So and quite a few countries in Africa that do not have any mail delivery at all. So a lot of e-commerce websites are getting creative, like Flipkart in India. They have partnered with the Debbie Wallers to deliver parcel deliveries. The third barrier that I want to talk about is the online payment systems. So in 2014, there are 85 countries with only 10% or less people purchasing something online. And that's almost half of the 170 countries that was surveyed. This could be an issue of demand. So it could be that people are concerned about payment securities, and this is a survey of the EU countries. 1 in 5 individuals did not purchase in Portugal, France, Spain, Hungary, and Slovenia. These individuals did not purchase anything online because of payment security concerns. But it could also be an issue of supply. There are not many online payment systems for businesses that are available in Africa and Central Asia. And this is probably a bigger issue that is not related to PayPal wanting to get into these countries is probably related to financial regulation systems that Usman will talk about. And then finally, the last barrier is about data and privacy issues. I won't go into detail about this because Anupam is a bigger expert here, but here is a survey of, here's a survey of consumers, and the question asked to them was, do they agree whether or not online data and personal information should be physically stored in their, the server in their own country? And a majority of them agree that that is so. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Next, we have Anupam Chander, who's a professor at the University of California at Davis and the author of the Electronic Silk Road.
Great. Thank you very much. And I want to especially thank Susan Aronson, Michael Farentino for inviting me. I'm really honored to be here. So I want to echo everything that's been said before. I agree with, it's +1 or a thumbs up for everything that's been said before. And certainly with Usman, I'm going to kind of, regardless of what he says, I'm going to agree with it. And so let's begin at that. So I'm going to suggest some additional considerations beyond those that have already been mentioned. So as we know, the last half century saw major improvements in economic development as the world liberalized in terms of providing goods flow across borders. So the next half century, I think, should be this half century of services. But there's immense problems before that happens. And so I want to focus on some of those issues. So what I want to do is kind of summarize what I think are some of the special issues in this context. And so I will focus first on internal issues within developing countries, then external issues where advanced economies are actually providing the barriers to trade. So the internal issues among developing countries, let's begin there. So intermediary liability rules can make it very hard for a company to begin in that space. So imagine if you are a platform offering up new services and you want to figure out where you are going to launch. Will you launch in a place that essentially makes you responsible for every action of any one of its users? So this is a big question across the world. The United States created space actually for intermediaries to develop. So the web that we have today is actually a result of some rules that came out in the 1990s. So in particular, the Communications Decency Act, Section 230, and the DMCA Title II, which largely lack ideal analogs across the world. That is, in the United States, we created particular regimes that protected intermediaries from being liable for the actions of all their users. The rest of the world was more concerned about the use of the internet and placed responsibilities on intermediaries for policing their systems. So intermediary liability rules can be particularly harmful to new startups. But even imagine a company like Baidu. So just going to this week's news, Baidu lost 7% of its value yesterday. Why? Because it might be held responsible because someone used the Baidu search engine to learn about cancer treatment, and unfortunately he died. Now this was in the context of a promoted tweet, a sponsored ad, but here, so the question is whether Baidu is going to be responsible for all the advertising on its service. You can easily imagine if you are responsible for the truth of every ad on your service, then suddenly you are going to be very careful about what ads you run, right? And so this is a context in which a company even as large and significant as Baidu might see its market value substantially diminished in the future. And we've already seen this in the last day. So $5 billion in market capitalization reduction yesterday. Now, think about privacy rules. Sean has nicely pointed out the fact that many people across the world are concerned about privacy. And I think we should all be very concerned about privacy. In fact, we should be arguing for, and we should be activating for global privacy rules that protect information regardless of where it sits. But so the survey that Sean mentioned, which would say we're only secure if information is held in this country, is one that is a model that's only designed to actually harm developing countries, right? So that if the only way you can be secure is to make sure that your information stays in the United States or in Europe, that means that any company outside the world cannot actually process that information. So that privacy-centered approach is one that actually we know doesn't work in the goods context. Imagine if we said we can only trust goods that are made in the United States. Imagine if we said we can only trust food that is produced in the United States. Well, first of all, we would know that that's not true. Food can be produced well in Canada and Mexico. And we know that food can be produced badly in the United States, right? So there's plenty of history of wrong in the United States, and there's plenty of history of consumer protection outside our borders. So I think that's an important area in which we need to be concerned about privacy as a trade barrier. Now, I know that many people are concerned about that formulation, privacy as a trade barrier. But I think the question here is we know that historically we've seen trade rules that are designed for, we've seen consumer protection rules that seem ostensibly designed to promote consumer protection being used to actually stop foreign trade, right? So this is a kind of historical issue in trade law, the ability to use things that look like they are protecting consumers in a way that actually prevents foreign suppliers. So the exact nature of the rules themselves can make it very difficult to operate. So imagine privacy rules. So it's not only coming up with an international framework for privacy, but imagine privacy rules that say you can't use information for unexpected purposes. So I just want to give you an example from yesterday in my own life. Yesterday I did a Google search for the address of my hotel. I flew in yesterday, and after dinner was walking to my hotel. I wanted the address. And so Google reported not only the address, but it gave me my actual hotel reservation at this place as part of the search results. It helpfully told me, hey, look, we're not sharing this with anyone else. Okay, no, this is not coming up with everyone else's search results when they search for that hotel. But this is super helpful information. It would allow me, in case that there was problems, here's my reservation, here are the details. And you could have privacy rules that make that kind of information processing impossible. Okay, and so the next generation of internet innovation is going to come from companies that are making your lives so much easier by connecting the dots, by anticipating your needs, right, in unexpected ways. So privacy rules that make it impossible to process information in unexpected ways are going to be ones that make it impossible to innovate. And the great thing about this is that for American companies is that our rules will not do that. Okay, so in other words, the only companies that will actually offer great innovations of unexpected connecting the dots are going to be American companies. So if you think about internal rules within developing countries, I think this is an area to worry about. So let me give you another example. So privacy rules in India. So India is seeking, sorry, I need to be very quick here. India is seeking to persuade Europe that it was a good place to send information, created a whole host of privacy rules in 2011. The rules were written in a way that suddenly everyone said, oh my goodness, this is going to make it impossible to send information to India. because you need the consent of every individual for that transfer. Okay. India hastily revised its rules through a press note, but did so simply by saying, if you're outside this country, you aren't subject to these rules. Okay. What that had the net effect of was saying, if you're a foreigner, you don't want to build an establishment in India, you don't want to invest in India because suddenly you're not going to be subject to these rules. Okay. So if you're ever thinking of processing your information in India, just stay out of India physically. Okay, a very clever rule. So think about this as kind of internal issues. Censorship. So if we make rules that's essentially that countries say this kind of information should be banished from the internet, obviously we have lots of such rules. We have rules regarding child pornography, it might be drug trade, it might be gun trafficking, etc. But if you make rules that are very that make it hard for information to be exchanged, then what's going to happen is that people are going to turn to foreign platforms to share information. So in this context, many countries have toyed with the idea of real names. That is, insisting that when you comment on something on the web, you use your real name or your real government ID. All that does, because people want to comment on things, but they also don't want to necessarily be held responsible for all those things till the end of their days, it means that they turn to typically American platforms that don't have such responsibilities attached to them. So it's yet another way that domestic regulation makes it hard for internet innovation in these spaces. Now, external. So let's talk about what we in the United States and Europe have done in this context. And I want to just show you first one additional slide. These are the countries. It just happens that Canada is very large physically, so it actually looks even bigger than it is, than the reality. These are the countries that are declared adequate for Europe to transfer information. Okay. Half of these are tiny little island states that don't even show up on this map because they're too tiny to be reported, right? So it's Argentina, very recently Uruguay, Switzerland, of course, because it's really part of Europe for all intents and purposes, for a part of the European Union, Israel, New Zealand, which you can't see on this map, and Canada, okay? That's the sum total of countries that are okay to transfer information. Okay, so let me just conclude very quickly here. So that set of rules it makes it very difficult to operate for countries outside Europe. It turns out that it's easier if you want to be declared adequate for getting information from Europe. It's easier really to apply for membership in the EU than it is to seek data adequacy ruling from Europe. And the basis for these data adequacy rulings is highly politicized. Okay, so let me just conclude with that, and we'll discuss more things later. Thanks, Victoria.
Thanks so much. Last but not least, we have Usman Ahmed from PayPal.
All right. Thank you to Susan and the organizers and the sponsors for this wonderful event. It's been a good first day. Excited about where the second day is taking us. And what I really like about the academic conferences is it gives me, who is in a company and has to deal with real fires on the ground very regularly, to take a step back and look at these issues from a macro perspective and try to think about, what kind of world do we want to live in? How do we want to get these rules right? And what do we want the system to look like? And so the panel, or the title of our panel is on digital trade, but I really appreciated the talk by Klaus Tilmas from the World Bank yesterday, because he talked about that there's a set of barriers that almost, let's say, pre-exist or that are baseline to getting to trading and getting to digital. And so I wanted to take an academic opportunity to lay out kind of a framework for how to think about the barriers as being built on top of each other. So if we're to look at a baseline, I think Klaus did a really good job of laying out a few things. I would describe 4 potential barriers: connectivity, identity, financial inclusion, and literacy. And Klaus was very interesting in bringing up the topic of literacy, because I think when we think about digital, we don't usually think about the baseline capability to be able to read, but you need to have that if you're going to benefit from the digital economy. Some numbers. There are 4 billion people that are unconnected to the internet. There's 1.5 billion people that are unable to prove their identity. There are 2 billion people that are not financially included or that are unbanked. And there are 785 million people that are illiterate. There's probably a tremendous overlap of those groups. They're probably mostly the same people. People who are illiterate are probably unbanked and don't have access to the internet. So this is a target, a group of folks that need these 4 baseline capabilities if we're going to eventually bring them into the concept of digital trade. And I think those 4 issues are incredibly important, both from a digital trade perspective, but also just a general developmental perspective, is gaining connectivity, being included in the larger financial system, having an identity, and being able to read. So then again, before we get to digital trade, there's a second order of barriers that I would describe from a business perspective. So if we're talking about entrepreneurs and the ones who would engage in digital trade, I think there's a second order of barrier, again, before they actually get to trading across borders. I think this term is really good, but it's difficult to describe, the concept of e-literacy. So we talked a little bit about it yesterday, this idea of there's a set of tools or products that a business or an entrepreneur needs to be able to access and understand how to use: a web browser, a payment system, a online marketplace. There are a set of tools that the entrepreneur or small business needs to be able to understand how to practically use and access and work with. And there's this debate amongst people who work on access to the internet of the computer hole-in-the-wall theory versus the e-literacy theory. The computer hole-in-the-wall theory says that in India, there was a project by Oracle a long time ago where they put a computer in a hole in the wall and some kid picked it up and started programming on it and figured it out. I think that is the massive outlier. That's not like the way we should think about development and digital technology. It's not just some magical thing that just happens. It really requires focus. And there's some amazing economic research that's come out of Bangladesh recently, where if you provide that educational support along with funding and technology, that's where you see the developmental impacts. Secondly, it was mentioned very briefly yesterday, but I want to focus in on it because it's an important concept, again, that's broader than just digital trade, but essential, and that's the concept of incorporation. And incorporation in a lot of developing countries is a tremendously difficult task, particularly if you're a small business, small entity, outside the formal system, to actually find out how to register your business, set it up so that you can link into the broader system is actually quite a difficult task. And then thirdly, again, before we're still not even to digital trade yet, sorry to lay all this out, is access to finance. So the International Labor Organization surveys businesses around the world and asks them, what's the number one barrier that you face? And uniformly they say access to finance. We can't get the funding to start my business or to take my business from an idea to a product or from one product to 10 products or whatever it is. Access to finance is kind of a universal second order barrier. Now we're finally to digital trade, and it's already been talked about by experts who are far more steeped in these issues than I am. But I would just highlight again 3. When PayPal surveyed about 1,200 businesses who are online, what's the number one barrier you face? They said what Ralph said, customs, shipping, logistics. If you're a small business and you're trading online, getting your products across the border or making sure they get to your end customer is just something that they don't understand how to do. So if you're already online, you're already trading, and you're a physical product manufacturer or retailer, that's kind of your barrier and your cross to bear, and something very difficult for them to deal with. If you're a service provider, you obviously don't have that set of issues because you're not moving physical products across the border. It becomes, and Anupam has written tremendous pieces on this, the concept of licensing. So depending on what type of entity you are, you may not be able to trade that service outside of your border because you can't get a license to provide that medical or legal or accounting or professional service into another country. And increasingly, now that's not an issue from a technological perspective. Upwork, a platform for service providers, has businesses from 180 countries on it, and you can easily provide that service to another country. But if you're not licensed to provide it, you may be barred. And lastly is localization, and Anupam has hit on this, so I won't spend much more time on it. Just two quick last points. One is the panel asks us to talk about what can governments do about all these barriers. And the first thing I want to say before going into specifics of what governments have done is note that I discussed a number of different barriers and issues. And off the top of my head, I was able to identify 6 different ministries: the telecom ministry, the home ministry, the finance ministry, the education ministry, the commerce ministry, and of course the trade ministry, that would all be involved in really fixing these things. So the first order ask that I would have of governments is cooperate amongst these different ministries. And I think Diego Molina Vega from Colombia spoke very eloquently yesterday about how he was able to bring together a number of different ministries to work on these problems. And that's what's essential from a purely administrative perspective. If we want to have this digital trade, we're going to need cooperation from a number of different internal ministries. Lastly, I just want to say there have been some good models in in tackling a number of these different barriers, and I think they could be models for different countries who are dealing with this to use. So on connectivity, I think the Global Connect initiative from the World Bank and the State Department has been a very exciting launch, bringing together developing world countries, providing, challenging them to make real commitments and providing funding for achieving connectivity goals. So it's a definite positive and something that can be built upon. Yesterday, Klaus spoke about the ID4D, Identity for Development, an initiative run out of the World Bank designed to provide countries that don't have good identity systems to leapfrog the traditional method of come in and write a birth certificate. No, let's go straight to digital identification. Let's create a unique identifier like is used in India to provide an identity system that is digital and that is cross-cutting. So I think a very exciting initiative there that developing countries could link into and benefit from. On financial inclusion, I think India, again, is a really great example of what they've done of banking several hundred million people in the last 5 years, again, built on this identity system and built on a focus on getting people into the financial system. On e-literacy, different governments around the world have been focusing on this. I think this is still an area where there's tremendous lack, and I think it's an area where there could be a lot of public-private partnership around educating through the private entities what are the services and products available to the developing world entrepreneur. The one program that I would highlight that's been quite successful is the International Trade Center has an e-solutions division. They have an amazing project which is manifested in a product called Made in Morocco, where they help these really, really small businesses in Morocco who have all the barriers that I mentioned. They're usually difficult to identify. They're not financially included. They're not connected. They bring them together, and first, as I mentioned, incorporation, they create a company for them, a co-op. They connect them in, they take pictures of their products, put them online for them, and create a payment system for them, linked in usually to a global payment network, and get payments from around the world and then disperse that back. So a really innovative, exciting product that I think could be mirrored in other countries. And then from a regulatory perspective on access to finance and financial inclusion, you've got the UK and Australia, which are doing very interesting regulatory sandbox things. Last thing I'll just mention is what's the, Klaus said yesterday, it's very difficult to measure what removing some of these barriers does from a development perspective. So we're going to have some data coming out next week where we looked at businesses on PayPal who don't trade versus businesses that do trade. And Ralph mentions that you have these anecdotes that, businesses, once they start trading, it's, 5x growth, 10x growth, you see them really shoot off. Our data, in a very just straightforward, simple manner, shows that the businesses that do trade using PayPal have double the sales of the ones who don't. So it's a great opportunity. Thanks.
Thanks, guys. If I could get all four of you to come up here. So I'm going to ask a question and then turn it over to the audience for you all. I think they've done a really good job laying out the scope of all of the barriers to digital trade. I wanted to ask because there are sort of two sides of the trade piece. One is countries getting access into developing countries, and developed companies getting access into developing countries, and the other is companies within developing countries being able to take advantage of the digital space. And some of the barriers that you all talked about, data localization, censorship, import tariffs, they're sort of ostensibly aimed at helping companies within the country have the space to develop and grow. For example, Anupam mentioned Baidu, and you could make the argument that part of the reason why Baidu is so successful is because China doesn't allow Google to be accessed in China. So I was just wondering if you all could speak to some policies that you think would better help digital companies grow in developing countries without necessarily putting in place those barriers.
So I think there's a concern here with respect to countries barring foreign information services, which also goes beyond economics. And that's a special concern with respect to China. So countries have often used their control over local information services as a way to ensure that governments have done this to ensure that they remain in power. And so I think we have to be cautious in this context because there's a direct relationship between the information service provider and where it's located and the ability of people to access free information. So in this context, efforts to force consumers only to receive local content has the negative effect of barring them from receiving anything that's not controlled by that local government in terms of what's politically acceptable within that country. So I want to begin by just making sure that that's on the table. I think in general, data localization turns out not to be particularly attractive as a way to spur economic development because the way that you can localize data is you contract for local servers. And local servers employ very few people, it turns out, right? If you've been to a data farm, these things are just large arrays of computers. And there might be one guy, it's almost always a guy, running the farm. And they use a lot of energy. And the other amazing thing is that all those computers are imported. And so they come often from the United States because they're manufactured by companies like Dell. And so data localization doesn't have that kind of the expectation that suddenly we grow a local internet economy. It actually leads to importing a lot of hard goods from abroad, the United States and China principally. And secondly, it doesn't employ anyone locally.
So I was just thinking about this issue about the barriers and also about firms on the internet. And There's one thing that came to mind, which was that the internet is also something that makes a lot of firms mobile, especially services firms. And so when you think about barriers and you think about developing countries, and all the barriers that we talked about, there's also another set of issues that I think might be worth highlighting as well, which is that firms can move around, and if they're not happy with the logistics systems in the country that they're working on, or if they're not happy with the financial payment systems, they could just move to another country, or they could set up in another country. And so what these firms might be more interested in is a good business environment in the countries that they're willing to locate in, and that could then lead to a question of, is there a role for tax incentives, or is there a role for then regional and plurilateral agreements that give access to these firms in these countries to where their customers are located in, barring all the privacy and data localization issues, right? So it's like removing services trade restrictions in those countries. So that's sort of another issue that I was thinking about.
Well, I guess I would just add to Anupam's point about localization, and Anupam talked about it in the data flows context, which is certainly where the internet companies or the internet ecosystem focuses on. But as I described in my talk, the internet ecosystem in digital trade is way broader. So localization barriers, whether it's you have to be a local incorporated entity to offer this product or service, can be a huge problem. Whether you have to deal in local currency, which makes it very difficult for somebody who's not based in that country or who hasn't, set up their financial system in that country. Those can be additional localization barriers that can make it very difficult for an external player to offer anything in a country.
And just to kind of follow up on that, one of the big issues in TPP is that financial services data has been carved out from localization measures, and for regulatory reasons. And so I'm wondering whether you think there's some sort of spillover effect where because TPP is supposed to be the U.S. writing the rules of the road for trade, where that might make it easier for developing countries to sort of point to that policy and say, hey, we want to localize data for regulatory reasons as well.
I mean, the TPP has, just like any trade agreement, carve-outs and exceptions, and I think those are put in by government policymakers to maintain flexibility. I think that the financial services piece was a particularly difficult issue for USTR and for Treasury and others to figure out and work on. And I think, it'll be interesting to see how that issue proceeds in the future trade agreements with the Trade and Services Agreement and the negotiation with the European Union. I also think that, the Global Agreement on Tariffs on Trade and Services has interesting provisions on financial services localization that could potentially be tapped into and looked at when it comes to localization on financial services in particular. But I take your point about, the notion of there's a great rule about free flow of data and being able to stop server localization, but you don't want the exceptions to eat the rule. So I think that's right, and I think there should be a good amount of thinking on how to create a regime that works like that, because you don't want everything in the ecosystem to shift into the exception. So that makes a lot of sense.
So if anybody has any questions, right here. Yes, you.
Thank you for this panel. E-commerce is good and it should be developed, there's no problem. But before e-commerce, there's a lot of what I call destruction factors that destroy individuals and family and businesses. Now, if we go to e-commerce, obviously the destruction will be even worse and getting tremendous destruction in almost every segment of our life, including the consumers and businesses. And if you think you want the government to help you, the government maybe is on the destruction factors, maybe among them is the worst. And then you have government contractors, you have big corporation contractors, everything is involved. I just wonder if this panel can really ask government to enforce the law enforcement to protect the businesses and the consumers all at the same time.
Sure. Maybe over here?
Sure. Thomas Whitehead with British Telecom. There's a really important concept underlying a lot of rules around privacy, localization, and intermediary liability that I don't think I heard any of you mention, which is security. Most of your proposals seem to suggest, or rather support, the ubiquity of data. How would you suggest making data both ubiquitous and secure?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Rosemary Seguero. I'm a company called Seguero's International Group. We focus on SMEs in Kenya and other African countries. Thank you so much, FedEx, for your solution. And looking at your solution, yesterday I talked about people with disability. FedEx would help the SMEs, especially those with low capacity of what they want to sell or buy, and especially people with disability, the blind, the deaf, and the disabled who are entrepreneurs. This would help them instead of looking for a way fare to go to Dubai, to China, and to shopping. This is very, very important. I want to see how we can collaborate and work with me in African countries. I would be your agent through my SMEs. And looking at the other thing of financial inclusion, our company was the first company to write a missing middle concept to the World Bank, to the IFC World Bank, looking at helping the small and medium businesses. After 5 years, they said they would not give us money because we were a small company. And this is where we are getting to, lifting those small companies from the ground to develop to big companies, looking at manufacturing, processing, and then come to FedEx. How do you export your products? But they say so how do we make this happen? Looking at the digital, where we have now come up with our own application, now sending money to our SMEs from the US to Kenya and other countries so that they can buy things in China and export to and sell to other people. So how do we make this happen? Because it will go to M-Pesa. Kenya, we have good system of M-Pesa. But getting to Western Union, it may not work as our own application. So how do we make this application of transfer from here to Kenya? We will be demonstrating to the U.S. Treasury, my group, on our application. So how do we partner and work together? And the most important thing is education. Educating the SMEs and the people on TikTok, because here we are talking, but those people don't have cell phone, they don't have light even to use for the TikTok itself. So how do we make this work? Thank you so much.
I think we'll maybe start with those three.
So I'll take, I think, the first and the third question. I think the first question was really about kind of consumer protection for consumers and the businesses that are kind of operating in a new e-commerce space and increasingly cross-border. And I think it's a good point. And I think, one of the things that does hold e-commerce back still is this issue of trust and confidence in the system. If I'm a consumer buying something from another country, I have some concerns maybe about how, if I don't like the product, will I be able to send it back, the payment issues. So I think we have a lot that we can think about and look at in terms of building more trust and confidence in cross-border e-commerce. And that's why this idea, again, of looking at kind of multinational solutions to these things, we think has some potential. The other question about from the woman from Kenya on SMEs, I would just say that from what I hear, Kenya is doing some really excellent work on SMEs. I think your governments in places like the WTO understand this, and they've been active in terms of leading and saying this is an important issue that Kenya sees as an opportunity And you mentioned people with disabilities. One of the presentations that I saw in Vietnam was from a small business who did hire people with disabilities to do kind of light manufacturing. And again, they were then put these products onto an internet platform that helped them advertise and get exposure for those products around the world, and they were selling them. And it was a really compelling story about how e-commerce and access to the global economy helped a very small group of local folks that had disabilities. And so those are the kinds of opportunities that are out there. And again, we think that it's a huge opportunity for developing countries because you're able to really kind of transcend your own borders.
I just wanted to reply to the first question about the destruction of firms and the idea that the internet or e-commerce is destroying firms. It is true. There is, the idea that if firms use more internet, they become more productive, or they become larger and have more market size. And so there are other firms that will exit the market. But then there is also the flip side, which is that firms are entering the market as well. So there's a lot of research that show that internet does help firms, smaller firms, as well as firms that are led by minority groups, disabled people, that do enter the market, and that makes the market more vibrant. And ultimately, if you think about it on aggregate, there will be some effects on aggregate productivity, and then there's flow through in economic growth for the country as well. So.
And I want to commend, with respect to the first question, I want to commend the World Bank's report on digital dividends, which considers not only the positive things that the digital economy brings to economic development, but also some of the negative aspects of it. So, and I appreciate your question. It's certainly true that when you have more competition, this will lead to those who were protected by being the local incumbents facing potentially difficult competition. So I think that's certainly true. I want to come to the question about security, which is a great question. And again, I want to just emphasize how all these important values that we have, privacy, consumer protection, security, can all be used in ways that actually benefit local providers over foreign providers. And so, international trade law is all about making sure that we have consumer protection, that we have safe products. But it's also about making sure that we don't write rules that say the only way you can have safe products is if they are provided from people within that country, right? Security can be used exactly in this protectionist way. Consider the Schrems decision, which says basically you can't send data from Europe to the United States because of US surveillance practices. Well, if you look at Europe, Europe has extensive surveillance practices. The UK is passing a snoopers charter. France is in a state of emergency. Hungary has a European Court of Human Rights judgment that just said its national surveillance apparatus violates European people's rights. So, but there's no problem having information within those jurisdictions. That's all safe and secure suddenly. Well, I think we should insist on security wherever we have the information, that we should insist on privacy wherever that information is stored. We should insist on consumer protection wherever that information is provided from. And that's what trade is about. Trade is about making sure that we don't use these legitimate goals of protecting people as a way to protect local businesses.
Yeah, I also want to respond to the security question because I think it was spot on, and I think it's a problem that as internet companies and folks who are talking about the importance of digital trade, we almost paint it as a dichotomy between innovation and development and security, when I think that that's absolutely wrong. And I often talk about the example of PayPal as a company. When it got created, it did two things. There were two problems, right? There was, in the late 90s, that you could go online and buy stuff. but it was difficult. You didn't want to put in your credit card information. It was a hassle. You had to put in your address. You had to put in all this stuff. It was a hassle. But it was also insecure to put all that information online and give it over to somebody who you've never met and didn't necessarily trust. And I thought Sean had a great slide about trust in online payments and a lack of it. When we didn't do it. Sorry, when Brunswick Group did a study of online trust in the EU, it showed that PayPal was the most trusted brand, and the reason for that was encryption, tokenization, security. The notion that your financial information doesn't get shared with the merchant. So that was an innovation and a security apparatus coming together and providing a benefit. And I think you're absolutely right that we need to paint digital trade and these issues, I think Anupam put it very well, as not lowering security standards. It's about getting right security standards across the board. And then just really quickly on the financial inclusion point, I think the next wave of financial inclusion issues is going to be beyond financial inclusion, financial participation. So people are now quote unquote included in the system, but through M-Pesa, but they can't actually expand out to the broader ecosystem, right? And so that's where a product like, it sounded like things you're working on or things that others are working on to bring interoperability between these systems is going to be incredibly important. And I think that's where a lot of work needs to be done.
More questions? Oh, Susan over here.
Implicit in the way we're discussing this, we're sort of saying information is all the same, but yet I almost felt like when you were talking, Anupam, you didn't say this, but I almost had this impression you were describing data localization as almost a form of censorship. And in some ways it probably is that, but it's not. And I wonder if can I just ask everyone to comment, is this a disservice? Should we be distinguishing various types of information? Like here's copyright information, here's data essential to business, or let's call it proprietary data. And then let's find some umbrella term for other types. Maybe that will be helpful to us, or maybe I'm wrong. Well, that's my question.
Over there.
I wanted to build exactly on those. Oh, I'm sorry. Rachel Pfeffer from the Library of Congress. I wanted to build on the question around data localization. Apart from, you all mentioned there might be legitimate public policy, regulatory reasons for needing that. Apart from that, do you see the biggest barriers to data localization, the regulations being driven because people don't understand the concept of cloud computing, of data being ubiquitous? It doesn't really matter where your server is. Is it a cultural barrier? Is it a generational barrier? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, or if any of you have any data on that, and what potential solutions to whether it's educational or regulatory or international rules.
And we'll go right here too.
Warren Coates, retired from the International Monetary Fund. First of all, thank you all for really stimulating discussions this morning and yesterday as well. I wanted to raise a different dimension of trust as a barrier to digital trade and so on. In the sort of business model sense of when you're dealing with people peer-to-peer and you don't know the person at the other end, how do you trust them? How does this new way of doing business, eliminating a lot of traditional monitors, companies and so on that have that responsibility, how do you find new ways of establishing trust? And Uber had its way of rating, and these are innovative things that need to be discovered or developed. And it's easy to imagine Mr. Chander focusing to governments pretending that they're protecting people in this way, actually as a way of protecting indigenous players in the game and so on. But So if you would just comment on again, the interplay between a market freely exploring for new ways of developing trust with new tools, et cetera, and where the government comes in either to impede or to allow that.
It's not in my wheelhouse.
So let me begin on issues of data localization that Susan and you've raised. So I agree that data localization can actually be used as a bulwark for censorship. So I actually do think that is it was implicit in my remarks, but I want to make it explicit here. And let me give you some examples of this. So what Russia's data localization law does, which just went into effect this last September, it says essentially that you have to have your Russian information stored in Russia. It doesn't actually say you can't take Russian information outside Russia. So the interpretations I've heard from various people, including businesses, is that it's okay that they can share information and move it outside the country as long as they have a local copy. And I'm hearing, some nodding in the room with respect to that interpretation. So why have data localization at all? It's not the anti-surveillance sphere. Okay, the Brits are going to be monitoring what Russians are doing. It's because you want to be able to control and go after anyone who says something wrong on the Russian internet. That's the goal, right? So data localization can often be used in a way to make sure that you can find out who is saying something that the government dislikes. So I think it can be used that way. Now, it's hard for... I have this idea of different categories of data. Certainly, we have that concept in the United States. We say that financial information, health information, educational information about students. We have different kinds of rules with respect to that. Credit information. So we have different rules in the United States already, and we certainly categorize this. So I think that is also exists in the United States, and I can understand thinking that different kinds of data needs different kinds of rules. So I totally agree with that. Now, with respect to the question of kind of trust across borders, one of the things what can governments do to increase that trust? I think the United States, we've seen some really positive efforts by the U.S. authorities to say that if you are misleading people about your security practices, about your privacy practices, we're going to go after you, and we're going to make sure that you pay a hefty penalty. And that process, I think, has been useful to improving trust among users. That is, knowing that there's a regulator out there that will say that if you are violating the security promises you're making or the privacy promises you're making, that will lead to sanctions. I think that's a very important exercise. We see that in the United States. We don't see that really in much of the rest of the world, even though they're declared, quotes, adequate for European data protection.
I would just make one comment on the last point about the government role, because I think it's a very careful line that needs to be played, right, between the government's rightful interest in ensuring trust and security, but not choosing a winner or choosing a technology solution that is the one that everybody across the ecosystem should use. Because the problem with that is not only does it usually favor an incumbent or somebody who already has that technology, it stems innovation. So security is an ongoing, constant, iterative issue, and something that everybody in the ecosystem. And so your point about peer-to-peer, what the internet has enabled it to do is lower the cost massively of a trusted intermediary, right? So it used to be, I needed to have a cousin in that country who could go and meet the person and verify everything for me, and then be there when the thing was delivered or the service, whatever. Now it's, I have an intermediary that is very low cost to access and trust, and provides me interesting protection. So a lot of the online payments companies offer buyer protection. It's like, oh, I can buy this because I know the intermediary will make me whole. And so those are really important private sector innovations that are great, I think, from a consumer perspective. And if a government was to go and pick a technology or pick a solution or say everybody in the ecosystem has to do this, it super raises the costs, and it makes it really difficult for somebody new to innovate with a technology that might actually increase security. So it's a very difficult line to play, I think.
Sorry. Can I just comment on the trust issue as well? I think also one of the reasons why you see you see very little cross-border e-commerce transactions in the EU is because there is maybe lack of trust of, say, a foreign seller. And I think the EU digital trade agenda, the digital single market agenda, one of the things that they're looking at is improving their consumer protection rules to have, I guess, an EU-wide protection. But then I was thinking also about the private sector solutions, and one thing you mentioned was Uber and the ratings as well. And a lot of companies have gone down that route to actually, have ratings of, the sellers. And one example that I wanted to bring up was Alibaba. They had that rating system as well, but they also added on other features. One was that they have live chats, so you could actually have live chats with the sellers at the time that you're purchasing. Then there's also certification of the manufacturers, of the sellers. So the sellers can actually pay for Alibaba certification to actually, the basic level is Alibaba would send someone out there to actually show that this factory exists. And then, if you can pay a bit more to actually show, that they're actually producing the types of products. And there's also another example in India where they have cash on delivery, when you could order stuff online and you don't pay anything until the thing is delivered to your house, and you pay for it then. So I mean that's I guess innovative ways that the private sector has gone around the trust issues.
More questions?
Yeah, my name is Safili. My question here is digital trade and illiteracy. We go back to Africa, where 75% of the farmers are illiterate. And let's say Sri Lanka, we have cocoa, coffee, ginger, cassava. Then la Côte d'Ivoire, the highest producer of cocoa. How digital trade is going to improve that poor illiterate farmer to sell his crop on the international platform? Because they can't. So if there's going to be a cross-border trade, and now IT has been integrated into the platforms to sell goods and services, so how the poor farmers that have never been to school before going to sell their produce? This is my question.
Over here.
Thank you. My name is Prahan Senyi. I'm from Ethiopia. And my question is more on not on the control side or on the trust component, but more on the protectionist part, where, during the Industrial Revolution, there was a concept of encouraging domestic factories by putting some barriers in place, trade barriers. When we look at this digital globalization of businesses, obviously the benchmarks are set in the West, and the West business, the companies in the West have a huge advantage in terms of dominating the global business. For instance, in Ethiopia, the internet coverage is about 3% of the population. So technically, why don't we talk actually domestic innovations of internet, just as the manufacturing industry used to be, so that the population at the local stage will be more exposed by having the government and the private businesses on the driving seat. So I can see there is a problem with it, in both ways, but I don't see that side of it advocated, so that the population and the internal domestic, there is also language component to it. I know English is the dominant language, but if you go to Ethiopia, people barely use English in businesses. Other languages are in play. So could you comment on that?
And then one more.
I'm going to take the prerogative of host to ask a couple of questions that were posed on the Twitter account. So Thomas Strines, who's up at NYU at the moment, asks two questions. The first is how we will agree on the global rules on consumer protection, privacy, and security. Do we simply adopt the US standard? And then the second question is regarding localization incentives or pressures, as opposed to requirements, would those also be covered by TPP rules on data localization? So if we could respond to those as well, please.
I'd like to respond to the question from the gentleman in the back about agriculture and how the digital economy can help. We're not heavily involved in kind of commodity agriculture, but I did participate in a World Economic Forum trip to South Africa, and I saw several examples of how digital access and access to kind of service providers that were outside of their local area were making a big difference. I'll give you a couple of them. One was access to a firm that was providing soil testing and soil analysis services. So the service was the farmer would kind of drill down and get a soil sample, put it in a tube, and ship this sample off. I think it was going to somewhere in Europe, and they would analyze that soil, and they would come back with a recommendation on the best crops to grow based on that soil, because a lot of times the farmers were growing things that weren't really well suited to their particular plot of land, and they weren't getting very good yields. And once they started doing this and they planted what the recommendation was, the yields would double. They were much more productive. It was really astounding. And this small company, entrepreneurial company, was really growing really quickly. Another application was, of course, in getting access to pricing, understanding what the global prices were for their crops, how much they should be charging for them. And then lastly, something I've heard about was called the Digital Cow project, and I think you can Google that and find out. This is a cow that's got sensors on it, and they're able to track its movements, its activities in relation to its milk production. And they are learning great things about kind of the environment that a cow likes and produces more milk in, and the environments that cows don't like. And so they're able to, again, improve the yield from a milk cow by digital technologies and being able to kind of, a wearable for a cow, a Fitbit, if you will, on a cow. And it's producing, again, really astonishing results. So I think there are a lot of applications that can help small farmers around the world.
Just to add to the point on agriculture, there's a lot of research that shows that information technology or the internet has helped farmers as well. And I'll just give you two examples. One is that farmers were receiving weather reports on their mobile phones, and they were able to better, tend to their crops. And then the other one was also about prices. There were fishermen that were receiving prices of, the fishes that they caught, and they know which port to go to, and so that allowed them to get higher prices for their crops. So.
So with respect to digital cows, I'm from UC Davis, where we know all about cows. And so I really like that. And of course, I can also tell you, since I'm from California, that cows produce best in California. Looking over the Pacific Ocean, it's ideal. Let me come to a gentleman from Ethiopia who was asking a question about the model for development, the 20th century kind of import substitution model applied to these kind of 21st century approaches. The first thing, obviously, that I would say is import substitution didn't work very well in the 20th century, so I'm not sure it's an ideal basis on which to build. Rather, I would suggest that there are different things that governments should do. One is to make sure that their own kind of regulatory system is designed for this kind of new set of services, that is designed to promote innovation. And I think we've heard from a number of people who've talked about the ways that the laws of a particular country can often hamper their own development. So I think that's important. I also think it's important for governments to actually promote and even invest in, though it's hard to imagine government venture capital funds, et cetera, but to the extent that you can imagine governments actually putting money into supporting internet development and enterprise. I think that's really important. You can have prize systems in countries that do ICT for development within Ethiopia, right? So the best apps and have hackathons and things like that, right? You can imagine all kinds of a really progressive country that wants to build out its internet enterprise system, promoting local enterprise in all kinds of innovative ways. And so that's what I would recommend. With respect to the question from Twitter, it's very hard to figure out how to come up with these global rules. We see in the TPP the first hint of this, the coming of data protection obligations into trade. And so I think that might be the first kind of substantive step. Trade law is not an ideal place to hammer out these things. I totally agree with that. But it's not clear that there's an ideal alternative forum either. And so I think we may well see more movement in establishing kind of a minimum standards of protection of consumers and data in trade law. That might be a helpful way to start.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. Thanks to the panel. This was very insightful, and thanks to all of you for your great questions.
We will have a coffee break for the next 15 minutes in the lounge right around the corner. Thank you.